You're here to talk about epic fails with security and compliance. And a little bit about Sikich. If you're on the call, you're probably familiar with us, but you might not be familiar with all of our services. We've got three main branches. We've got the audit, accounting, tax consulting, things like that. We've got the technology branch shown in orange here, and that's where I work. It's IT services, managed IT, and that's where our cybersecurity is as well. And then we've got a number of advisory services as well. A little bit more about our cybersecurity practice where I work. We do assessments, we do penetration testing, ethical hacking. We do a lot of work in the payment card industry space. And I work on our team that does forensic investigations. So card breaches, ransomware events, all that kind of stuff. Sikich is actually one of the handful of firms in the United States certified to do PCI forensics or payment card breach forensics. So if somebody has a card breach, they have to call us or a company like us to come in and investigate that breach. So a lot of what we'll be talking about today comes from our experience in some of the ransomware events in 2021 and forensic investigations for card breaches in 2020. And with that, this is titled Avoiding Fails in Both Security and Compliance. I wanted to start with kind of a little background of what I see the difference between those two things is. So we're talking about security. We're talking about actually focusing on attackers getting into your environment and doing evil things like ransomware attacks or card theft or things like that. When we look at security, we're looking at a threat or risk-based approach, and we're often talking about things like ethical hacking, penetration testing, and things like that to check the security controls. If you're trying to build your security, if you're trying to build your IT, like cybersecurity posture focused on security, you typically need to have a good amount of expertise on hand to figure out what are the threats, who's trying to attack you, what kind of attacks might be successful, and then prioritize the efforts against those kind of threats. So it's good in that it helps you focus like on what's most important to put in place, but it means you need to have expertise on staff or outsourced to help you determine where those gaps are, what's most important. And that's as opposed to a compliance-based approach. A compliance-based approach is typically a bit more of a checklist. Some entity will have a checklist that says, do these things to be compliant with our standard, our framework. That's nice. It reduces the effort to figure out what do we need. We just go down the checklist and add the things it says we need. But because it's not prioritizing, customizing that for your environment, you can get a longer list of to-dos and maybe they're not as priority. But either approach alone doesn't really give you holistic coverage. A security-only approach can have gaps. A compliance-only approach can have gaps, and we'll talk through where those come from today. But that's the difference, and we'll talk about security, then we'll talk a bit about compliance. And to talk about security, we're going to talk about ransomware fails, because ransomware for most organizations was the biggest threat in 2021. And why was that the biggest threat in 2021? We're really a perfect storm of setting up an environment for ransomware attacks. You look at the email habits we have today. We do so much work through email, whether it's people are used to getting documents by email that they'll open, getting instructions to log into websites, getting a temporary password or a passcode. So it's email habits, or it's even just expanded now to any type of collaboration habits, doing things by text, getting passcodes by text, all that kind of stuff builds it. Combine that with remote access. In the last 2 years, we've had this huge growth in work from home employees, mainly due to COVID, and a lot of companies raced pretty quickly to implement work from home solutions for their employees. In some cases, maybe not securing those the best. Add to that our password practices today for the past 20 years, everybody's been hearing to set a good password, it should be at least 8 characters and a random combination of numbers and letters and things like that. And it turns out that's actually a pretty bad path, the 8-character random password. We'll talk about why that's bad a bit later, but it's causing us failures. And then finally, and a big driver of this is cryptocurrency. Never before the last couple years, with the boon of cryptocurrency, has there been a situation, environment where an attacker could perform an attack, do extortion, and have in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars that would lead to a almost completely untraceable immediate ransom payment. It's just created this environment where these attacks can happen. And I would add to this, 2021 was especially a perfect storm because we had a handful of unusual vulnerabilities that we typically don't see. One of those was in early 2021. If you remember Microsoft Exchange, Hafnium, might have seen it in the news, but they call it a 0-day, a vulnerability in the really common Microsoft Exchange mail server that was getting exploited by attackers before people knew about it before there was a patch available. Combine that with vulnerabilities in small business firewalls. You need to patch Windows, but a lot of small businesses don't know they need to patch their firewalls. And there were missing patches in small business firewalls in 2021 that allowed attackers to get in. So things like that were a little unique to 2021, really just made 2021 a great opportunity for attackers. And the result of that, everybody is a target for ransomware attacks, like every type of business. It used to be attackers would focus on banks, would focus on maybe healthcare because they could get social security numbers to do tax fraud or student loan fraud or things like that. If you got to do a manufacturer 5 years ago, how's that going to make you any money? It didn't. With ransomware now, if I can take a manufacturing floor down for 2 days, that owner's going to be willing to pay me a couple $100,000 if they can get back up faster, or to get back up at all because I've deleted their backups and things like that. So yeah, everybody's a target, down to the smallest mom and pop up to the largest enterprise organizations. So how are folks doing this? This is a little demo I like to show about how folks gain a foothold with passwords. So we here at Scrape the Dark Web to grab password dumps. So a password dump is when a hacker breaks into a company, steals their database, and in that database, they're able to steal the customer password list. Usually it's like a combination of email address and their password or their encrypted password, and the attackers will decrypt that. All that gets posted out to the internet because the attackers like to show off that they've done that. So we collect those things. We've got terabytes of these passwords, and we, like the attackers, can go search through these lists. So I'm doing a search command here of some lists that we've collected for any email addresses containing ansons.com and saying, tell me any passwords for those email addresses. And you'll see as soon as I start that search, it's spitting out email addresses. At some point in the past, this Justin at shalamandsons.com used the password Bodie78 at some website that later got breached, and now that email address and password combination is out there on the internet. And if I let this search run, I've stopped it here, but if I let it run, it would be a number of minutes that it would just run and scroll password after password over the screen. So that's just one way that attackers are, okay, if you reuse passwords, they can take advantage of that and break into your systems, get remote access. And then phishing is the other big one, but it's not even just phishing anymore. Everybody hits hard on like training against phishing and being on the outlook for that. But we're seeing a big rise in SMS text scam. I've had a couple of organizations even reach out to us to say, how are they getting into our systems because they know so much about us? These SMS text scams know what your job role is and what your phone number is because they're texting you and other specific information to get you to give up a password or do a financial transfer or something like that. As far as pretext calling, this is a new one. So one of my testers had posted, hey, did you know now that we're using Microsoft Teams and most people use it with a guest function to allow you to interact with companies outside of you, well, do you know that people can pop into your chats and you don't know they're from outside the company? And so he had created this fake ticket service at CloudWatch-Office remote, simulating an attacker, but it could have just been your friend Chris at your company with a couple letters changed. And yeah, I'd click on that because it's coming in Teams in my chat function, Zoom or whatever. It's not coming through an email, so I'm not thinking phishing. So yeah, they're continuing to increase the techniques they're using to get that foothold. And from there, and when talking about security, that's where it really gets scary, is they continue to increase their techniques and increase that foothold. This organization, MITRE, has put together what they call the MITRE attack framework. And what they've tried to do is enumerate every type of tool and technique that an attacker might use to take advantage to break into your environment. And they break it into different categories like reconnaissance, getting initial access, privilege escalation. So they've got a user account. How do they get to an admin account? And you can see this list even goes off the screen. There's more of it. And so when you're taking a security approach, it's holy crap. I'm supposed to try and understand all of these different tools and techniques that attackers are using and try and figure out, do I have controls in place, the right security controls, antivirus, patching, monitoring, things like that, to catch and block each of these. And that's the goal. It's a tough one. Luckily, there's some basics that kind of get you to 98% of catching or stopping these, but you can see how sophisticated the attacks are getting. And the other thing about how sophisticated the attackers are getting, 5 years ago, attacks were this sophisticated, but those sophisticated attacks were targeting large enterprises, target breach type things, governments, because they take a good amount of time and effort and you're giving up your tools. So someone can maybe see that tool, see that new script you wrote as an attacker, and they could develop a control for it. So you're reserving those things. That was 5 or 6 years ago. Nowadays, again, you can get a couple $100,000 from breaking into a 12-employee manufacturer. And yeah, it's worth it to use these sophisticated tools and techniques against really unsophisticated, from an IT perspective, targets like that, making it that much harder for all of us. And then, yeah, ransomware attacks. So the typical flow of a ransomware attack through that MITRE ATT&CK framework that we just saw is they're going to gain access through a phishing email, through a guessed or stolen password, get a low user level access, just in one employee, or even like the training PC or the time clock PC account, something like that gives them a foothold on the network. They will elevate privileges. There's a number of techniques to catch admin passwords off of the network as in traffic, to steal admin passwords out of the memory of computers where they've been logged into in the past, things like that. So there's a number of techniques to go from a user account to an admin account once you have that even tiniest foothold on a network. So they do that. Now they've got admin access. A lot of times from there, they'll start collecting data. They'll go grab the HR file share where there might be some employee data. They'll look for customer data. They'll look for anything that they could scare you with if they were to post it on the internet, and they'll collect that stuff, spend a few days collecting that stuff. And then usually on a Friday, because they want to launch this like Friday night, Saturday morning, they'll kick off their actual ransomware attack that starts crawling through all your servers and a lot of times your workstations as well, and encrypting all the data. Monday morning when you come in, you go to log into your computer and it lets you log in, but it says, hey, when you try to open a document, it says this document's not available. Here's a ransomware note instead. Please send us 2 Bitcoin and get your data back. And it's tough because they've taken your system down a lot of times during that kind of days leading up to the ransomware attack. They're hunting down your backups. So, we've seen them get into backup systems and delete backups. We've seen companies who are using what called virtual servers, just actually delete virtual servers or delete the backups of those virtual servers. Even going as far as a lot of companies 5, 6 years ago went from tape backups to what we call disk-based backups, where all your data just goes written to extra disks in an appliance in your data closet. Well, the attackers now see, okay, all your backups are on these disks in this appliance in the data closet. If I can steal the admin password for that appliance and just reset it to factory defaults, I've just deleted all your backups. And your only way to get your data back is to pay me a ransom so you can get the decryption key. So yeah, they're very aggressive and very thorough with trying to make sure that ransomware attack really pushes you to pay the ransom. Number one, to get your data back, but they also do these extortion demands. You'll see on the screen here, I'm showing a malware shaming site, which basically says, hey, here's a list of companies that we've broken into, and here's 5% of the data we stole from them to prove that we've stolen data from them. If they don't pay us our ransom within 2 days, we're going to post the other 95% of the data we stole from them. You're even losing the ability to get in front of the public notification when you've got one of these events, because you're like, okay, it's the first day of the ransomware attack. We're trying to get our heads around this. We're trying to reach out and get legal counsel to tell us what to do. And suddenly your name's already on the web on one of these shaming sites as having been compromised. So yeah, these are really damaging to an organization. So in the aftermath, we're talking with company owners, company leadership, and there's a few things that are pretty consistent themes of I wish I had known before this attack happened. The first one is that multi-factor authentication is so easy to, if you're not familiar with multi-factor authentication, that's really, I'm sure you're using it probably in a lot of ways today. You enter your username, you enter your password, but then before you can get in, you get a code on your phone that you have to type into the computer screen, or there's an app on your phone that you have to touch to say accept or approve, or get a number from, or things like that. So that's multi-factor authentication. It makes it so the attacker with just a stolen password can't get access. And a lot of these, we talked to the company owner and they're like, yeah, we talked about adding multi-factor to our remote access for employees, our VPN or home use for employees. We've talked about that a couple times for the past couple of years, but it seemed like a pain. Nobody would want to use it, and it was expensive. We never got around to it. And, a lot of times we've have that implemented and all their clients up and running on that within a day after the attack is doing. And everybody's, this is cool. We're not going to get hacked again because we've got this. That fear, uncertainty, to doubt about getting multi-factor in place is really often unwarranted just because it's less of a burden than you think it's going. The next one is really that my backups weren't safe from the hackers. I thought we had good backups. We just put in a $100,000 backup server and disk array, and you're telling me that the hacker just logged into it and deleted all my backups. Like, how did we not know that was possible? The third one, that we had so many antivirus gaps. Companies do put an antivirus, and it's such a fundamental thing. People are like, yeah, we've got antivirus. But when it comes around to do our investigation, we're like, well, they use this server as their foothold. The server wasn't running antivirus either because it was a test server, you guys forgot to install it, or because it was a unique server running a unique application and you were worried this antivirus was going to cause it to not work. And oh, by the way, here's 10 workstations and 5 other servers that for some reason didn't have running antivirus. And those are the ones the attacker initially took advantage of to elevate privileges, to get a better foothold, and then start spreading around the network. The next one, how easily it was to get admin access after infecting one computer. And this really comes down to like people not being very diligent about how they configure and who they give admin access. So things like having the company owner and every member of the leadership team in the Microsoft Windows domain admin groups, even though they don't really need those rights, it just made it easier for them to get to a file once in a while because they weren't blocked. Or having all of your IT staff use the same user ID. I log in to do my email as kbong. If I'm also logging in to do admin actions as kbong, well, then everywhere I log into my email, I'm giving up an admin password. I really should have a separate kbong password for my email and a kbong-admin password for those few times I need to do admin activities. Not doing some of that best practices around restricting where and how we use admin passwords makes it easy for attackers to go and grab those passwords and take advantage of them as well. And then how poor logging was. We come in where we're working to do the investigation. They're like, well, how did the bad guy get in? When did they get here? What was the way they got in? And we're like, your Windows event logs on your domain controllers are set to defaults, which means they're only holding 3 days worth of data. So I can tell you as of Wednesday, the attacker was hitting these 5 systems, but before Wednesday, when they first got in and how they got in and where they came from, like those logs got overwritten out less than a week later. So not before an attack, taking a look at logging and are we preserving all the data that we need? Yeah, those are the most regrets. So we looked at that MITRE ATT&CK framework and all the evil things the attackers are trying to do. Again, the good news is you can protect against the majority of that through just a handful of key security controls, some of which you've known for years, some of which are likely a bit new, we'll talk about today. Here's the ones you've probably known for years. Multi-factor authentication. People now know that you should have multi-factor authentication on your remote access, on your VPN, your remote desktops, anything like that. If you don't have it, you're behind the curve and you really should be trying to get there as quickly as possible. But also multi-factor authentication for email. We're seeing more and more attacks where the attacker is getting into mailboxes, and the amount of damage they can do just getting to a mailbox is pretty substantial as well. Their ability to reset passwords for other things, their ability to attack other employees and maybe get a foothold through sending phishing emails, their ability to do like payment fraud, hey, our bank account has changed, and just steal information, put you at risk that way. Yeah, if you're logging into anything from your company that's like a remote desktop or email access or anything like that, and it's just asking for a user and password, it's probably not good enough nowadays. The next one is commercial antivirus installed everywhere with the I call it the bells and whistles enabled. Windows comes with an antivirus, but it's not the most fully featured antivirus out there. There's a number of really good commercial antiviruses, good brand names, and they do more than just antivirus means I'm looking for a virus I've seen before based on a pattern in a file. But the good antiviruses have a lot of other features. They have things like host intrusion prevention that look for behaviors that look like attack. There's firewalls built in. There's like cloud-based threat prevention where if they get an executable, they'll actually set it up to the cloud and test it before it runs on your system. So a lot of cool things in these commercial antiviruses that do actually help you stop a lot of these types of threats. And having it everywhere, that's the other thing, is having a centralized console and like making sure that every server and every workstation has antivirus installed, and you're spending the time to limit those exceptions. Oh, hey, this file server got slow, so we disabled antivirus scanning for writes. Okay, that's a really bad idea. Figure out a different way to make the server go fast. Patch management, and everybody, again, I said, is familiar with patch management for your Windows computers, for your browser and things like that. We've been doing that for years. But a lot of small businesses aren't aware of how important it is to patch, especially your firewall, especially that VPN appliance or whatever it is that gives your employee remote access. You think you buy it, it's a network appliance, it just does its thing. It's not telling me on any screen that it needs to be patched. Again, we saw a number of breaches in 2021 that were a result of missing patches on those types of perimeter systems that allowed attackers to get a foothold or steal a password or something like that. The next one, 15 plus character passphrases, unique passwords per system. So the unique passwords per system, you saw why that was important with that password reuse demonstration I showed earlier. Once somebody uses a password somewhere, if it gets stolen from there, people are going to test that everywhere else they could use it. The 15 character passphrases is the new way that the industry is talking about doing passwords. And I've got this little graphic on the bottom. You see someone is using the password. It's a manipulation of Spartans. Maybe their high school basketball team was the Spartans or whatever. But if you think about that kind of combination, for a human, it's hard to remember. Like which characters were numbers instead of letters, or the @ symbol, what was the symbol on the end, something like that. And that's even when following a pattern like Spartans. If it was just a random string, it's even harder. We're going to write it down. Or I'm going to reuse. I'm using Spartans 1, Spartans 2, Spartans 3 every time I need to change my password. So really bad for humans. Hard to remember. People reuse it, all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, it's also easy for a computer to guess. We've got a server at our office, we call it our cracking server that our ethical hackers use, that if we get an encrypted Windows password off the wire or off a server or something, if it's 8 characters, no matter how complex it is, if it's 8 characters, we'll have the clear text password in 48 hours. That's the computing power we have today to do password guessing against Windows passwords. So yeah, 8 character complex passwords are really hard for humans and really easy for computers to break. On the other side, I've got the example, flying purple snail gallon. That's really easy for a human to remember. Think of a purple snail with wings, either in a gallon bucket or wearing a gallon hat or 10-gallon hat or something like that, and put it in your memory palace. If I was asking you a year from now, you're probably going to remember that password. You're going to think of this flying purple snail. But because of the length and complexity of that, the length of that, really, brute force cracking is thousands of years, because there's a lot more words than there are letters and things like that. So pushing people to passphrases. And what the industry is saying is once you move to those passphrases, you actually make it easier for people because you can remove the complexity requirements. You can see that this is just all lowercase letters and spaces, but it's still substantially harder for a computer to guess than the first password. The recommendations are even saying the need for password rotation every 90 days or whatever is not really showing any value. So if you move to these long passphrases and make sure people are using a different one on each system, rotating passwords isn't that important. Only rotate passwords when you have a need to. Don't make people come up with a new password every 6 months. So when you migrate from complex passwords to a passphrase model and teach people about how to do it, you can actually make their lives a lot easier in terms of remembering and using passwords. Other controls, logs set to remain 6 months of history. 6 months is the minimum. A lot of attacks we find happened even more than 6 months ago, but that's a lot of disk space to retain things. But I get at least 6 months so that if some attack happened a few months ago, we might be able to see what happened. I talked about that Microsoft Exchange vulnerability that happened in March of 2021. We saw, like I said, a number of systems got compromised before patches were out. We saw a lot of situations where in March, a computer was compromised. The attacker put like a backdoor on that Exchange server and then never touched that server again until August, September, October. Finally got around to trying to do an attack with that. They must have had so many targets to attack, they just didn't need to go attack it yet. And there again, we were trying to figure out, okay, what happened 6 months ago or longer to figure out how did this attacker get in. Phishing awareness exercises, not just teaching people about phishing, but actually sending them phishing emails is so effective at getting people to not fall for phishing. And then cyber liability insurance, it's such a good value to have that resource available. If you do get hit, you're not worried about making decisions about how much is this going to cost to do it right, an investigation and follow up. A few you might not already know about controls, endpoint detection and response, EDR applications. This is like the next level up of your desktop antivirus. So these software do everything the antivirus does and then some. They actually are monitoring kind of the network traffic and watching for indicators that this computer seems to have a command and control channel where it's getting instructions from an attacker out on the internet to do evil things, like because we know that endpoint on the internet is an evil endpoint, and recording that stuff and collaborating some of that information. So I think you're going to see a move from antivirus to these EDR tools. You might have even heard some of them. There's SentinelOne, Cylance, Carbon Black, things like the next one, advanced firewalling, application whitelisting, host intrusion monitoring. Those are kind of part of those EDR tools. Again, advancing what you're doing on the endpoint to secure those. The next one here, protecting your backups. You want to make sure that if an attacker steals all your passwords, they can't delete your backups. And the way you do that is you put them in the cloud, where you'd have to have MFA, and even the cloud provider is not going to let you delete them. Put them offline so they go back on tapes that get put on shelves. Attacker can't delete a bunch of tapes. Or put them, we call it in like a hardened enclave, put them in a network area that's behind multi-factor authentication. So if an attacker stole the network password that the admin uses every day, yeah, that would let them encrypt the file server, but it wouldn't let them encrypt the backups, because the backups use a different password and multi-factor authentication for that. The next one down, outbound traffic filtering. Once you have a breach, you have an opportunity to stop that attacker in a lot of cases by blocking or detecting what we call command and control, which is the instructions between the attacker servers and the infected workstations on your network. So at your perimeter, where you've got your firewall, newer next generation firewalls have features to look for traffic that looks like command and control based on what it looks like or based on who it's talking to, and say, hey, this isn't legitimate traffic, this looks like command and control. I think you've got an infected system that you should look into. I've blocked that traffic so the attacker can't tell it to start stealing data or encrypting stuff. So you combine that filtering with web content filtering, helps you with that as well, because a lot of that command and control is over web protocols. Biggest thing on the web content filtering is if you're filtering out like people can't go to poker sites and porn sites, great. In that category list where poker and porn and stuff are, there's also an uncategorized category, which means we don't know what it is. By default, that's usually set to allow. You want to set that to deny. You want to say, if we don't know what this website, block it by default. It's probably not that important, or at least not that safe. And if that employee really needs to get to it, we can let them go to that one site. We'd have to make a whitelist for that. So denying all their protocols. Protected DNS is just another way. That DNS is the domain name service system, how computers look up names to addresses on the internet. And there's services called protected DNS that if a computer's tried to a phishing site or a malware command and control site, that protected DNS will say, yeah, I'm not going to give you the right answer. That's an unsafe site. So another way to protect against those kind of malware command and control or phishing attacks against your network. Extending these workstation filtering controls to at-home users. So a lot of people have implemented these at their firewall at the corporate office, but now that all their people work from home, what's filtering their traffic? What's preventing them from going to phishing sites and malware command and control? And how do you, there's a number of ways to do that. Work with your technology provider to understand, do we have the same filtering controls when people work from home as when they're in the office? And then finally on your radar, if it's not on it already, is either a managed security service provider or a security event and information management system. These two functions do the same thing. Basically, they're watching logs and network for indicators of a compromise. Hey, a new admin account was just created, or hey, this 1,000 failed password attempts against this account last night. The managed security service provider is you're paying somebody else to take that and do that and tell you when something happens. The SIM is a device or appliance or server you put in your environment, and then your employees would be watching what alerts that generates and following up on them. So same function, two different approaches to it. But that's really the best way to catch, hey, a ransomware attack seems like it's starting. They haven't encrypted anything yet, but I think they've got a foothold in the network. That's how you catch that. So that's security. That's some background to protect yourself against probably the most likely attack that you're going to see beyond just payment fraud or things like that, the network-wide attack. Now we'll pivot over a bit to compliance fails, like what needs to be on your radar here. And again, as we said, compliance is more some entity has come up with a checklist that's going to help you be secure. And those checklists, why would you need that compliance checklist? Some of them are somebody's told you need it. If you're a retailer, your bank has given you the PCI payment card industry compliance checklist, and you need to go through it and check off that you're doing all the things on the list. If you're in healthcare, there's HIPAA high trust checklist to say, are you doing these list of things to protect patient information? So sometimes it's driven by government regulation or a similar kind of regulatory body in your industry. Other times it's really a list of best practices that someone has put together to help you. A good example there is like a lot of the NIST framework compliance information. NIST is just a government organization. They make compliance checklists that tell you, hey, if this is what you look like or this is the risk you have, here's a list of security controls that you should have in place. So there's a lot of them out there, and we're seeing a continuing increase in that. We're seeing more organizations are requiring SOC 2 type audits of their service providers to know they're secure. If you're doing work for that ultimately provides materials to the government, you're getting pushed to do CMMC audits. We'll talk about that in a second here. So we're seeing a growth in this, even for really small organizations. We're seeing even insurance carriers giving what's essentially a compliance checklist. Hey, if you want to buy cyber liability insurance from us, here 20 different security controls that you need to attest that you have in place, things like multi-factor authentication and antivirus and things like that. So yeah, compliance checklists are growing in need and popularity. And a lot of these compliance checklists, what they do is they expand beyond the just, in the first part of this talk, I said you should have antivirus and it should be configured this way. You should have a firewall and it should be configured this way. Well, that's the implementation. I've got that security control in place. That's that blue box on the top. For these compliance checklists, it's most of the effort is not those security controls. It's the efforts around making sure those controls are in place and effective. Not only do you have a patch management in place, but you've got a vulnerability management, a vulnerability scan, or some other process in place where every quarter you're checking that patches are actually applied. So it's the oversight, it's the process that makes sure that those security controls are in place, doing what they need to do, are being tested. Things aren't falling through the cracks. Hey, we've got 10 servers without antivirus. That's a good foothold for attackers. These compliance processes help prevent that from happening. And yeah, I said that there's a lot of increased interest in these compliance. You're probably, as a lot of organizations are having your customers or your regulatory bodies coming to you saying, are you compliant? Can you prove that to us? The cybersecurity maturity model certification, basically, its core is DoD contracts, but it's really expanding to, if you're a company that's not government, but you make a part that goes into a machine that the government uses, or work on a dock where naval vessels come and go, yeah, they're going to want you compliant with that CMMC certification. That's new. A lot of people are finding that that's something they need to start to be compliant with. And if you look at the folks that need to be compliant with that, it's folks that have never had really IT or security compliance requirements before. It's manufacturers. It's a dock, like they haven't worried about security before. Requests for proposals, questionnaires from insurance. A lot of privacy laws are pushing a lot of compliance requirements. So yeah, everybody's getting to a point where there are compliance obligations falling on you. If you are in the space where CMMC might apply, hitting people hard now. People are playing catch up to understand the standard. There's some very strict requirements in there, not just multi-factor authentication for remote access, but multi-factor authentication for kind of local access. So when you sit down at your computer, you may need to use a second factor to just log into your computer. And that's a step that's, again, somewhat of a, not really burden, but certainly some effort and time to implement that type of thing onto your environment. Being aware of these compliance requirements and figuring out where you fit certainly is a business need nowadays. And how do you approach that? If you're nowhere today, a good way to start is starting with a NIST SP 800-171 self-assessment. So I mentioned NIST earlier. It's a standard body. They create a lot of different compliance frameworks, assessment things. The starting point is this 800-171. It's literally a checklist, a scorecard of things like, hey, do you have these things in place to get you a set for what maybe you should have in place that you don't. So that's a good step for anybody. If you've got somebody coming to you saying you need to show us CMMC compliance, the next step is really a readiness assessment. We've ourselves gone through 800-171. We think we've got things in place. Now we're going to have another company come in and tell us whether we were right or wrong, or where do we have gaps, so we can put together a corrective action plan for those. And then again, going to the compliance, it's more than just a one-time, hey, we're missing antivirus on these 10 servers. It's building a security framework, a policy framework, a process framework, because there's ongoing requirements. We didn't just put in a firewall, but we put in a process that someone's reviewing the firewall rules twice a year, and someone's reviewing the logs from the firewall for malicious events on a regular basis. And changes from the firewall go through a change management process to make sure they're safe and approved before they go in. So that's the types of things that the compliance framework is going to push. What are the processes around that firewall? And then what is the similar things around every other workstation, server, antivirus, patching, security control you have? And as you can see, a lot of this really benefit from external subject matter help. It's hard to go alone if you're not in the security space. And yeah, from that, like, what kind of resources or services Sikich have that can help? We do compliance assessments across pretty much any compliance framework. Outside of those frameworks, we do risk and network security assessments. So this is less of, hey, you have a checklist that we need to see or if you're compliant against, and more of, hey, am I really secure? Like, we've done nothing. Tell me, what are the attackers going to take advantage of in my network? What am I missing? That's the risk and network security assessment. Hey, you're a manufacturer. You've got this facing the internet. That's probably a threat because you haven't patched this, or you're missing antivirus here, things like. The next step up from that is penetration testing or ethical hacking. Basically, if you think all the controls are in place, if you need to show people, like show leadership that the controls aren't in place, well, this is a good way to do it. If everybody thinks your environment's secure, but you don't think it is, a penetration test can validate that it is or show you, well, no, within a couple of days, they were able to guess this password for the time clock and then use that to get an admin account and use that to break into your backups. And I'll let you know that our penetration testing team, for someone who's never had a penetration test before, I would say that 80% of the time they're getting admin access to the network by the end of the test. Because if you haven't gone through that type of exercise before to understand all the ways under the hood that people can gain access, can elevate privileges to get admin access, you haven't put some of these best practices in place to protect against. We've got virtual CISO or vCISO support. So this is, hey, you're a small organization, you've got one IT guy that does the desktop support, the printer support, installs the applications. You aren't as a size to have a chief information security officer, but it would be good to have someone with that knowledge, know your business, know your company, and guide you on what's next. And that's what our virtual CISO is. It's like sized for how much time you need every month, every quarter, whatever, with one of our experts to say, for your organization, this is the next thing you should be putting in place. This is where you should be spending your security dollars. This is a gap you have. Let's talk about these different ways to address it. Filling that hole in a smaller amounts for a smaller organization. And then IT solutions and managed services. So outside of our security services, we actually have an IT solutions group that does managed services, manage your servers, manage your workstations, manage your cloud environment, do deployments, do application installation upgrades. So we do outsourced IT as well to help you fix. It's nice to have that ability. You know, here from my side on the cybersecurity, it's nice if I'm working with somebody on a ransomware breach and it's okay, they took down our database and we don't have somebody on staff that can rebuild that database today and we need it back up today, I can reach out to our IT solutions group and say, hey, we're doing this incident response and we need to rebuild a database. Can you have a database engineer that can jump in and help me rebuild this database today? We partner up that way and can fully respond to a security incident. So that's the brain dump of what we've seen in 2021, what the risks are, how to protect against yourself, where to get started with compliance. Does anybody have, we got a poll question if you want someone from Sikich to follow up with you. I'll go ahead and respond to that. Thanks, Rich. He says, great job. Hopefully this was helpful. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll just hang on here a couple minutes in case people have follow-up questions or responding to the survey. But yeah, you know how to reach us. As again, this is Kevin Bong. Reach out to me individually as well. I don't have my contact information on this last slide, I see, but certainly contact your Sikich rep and they can track me down. We are happy to help out. And yeah, if you have a breach, I'm probably the person they'll put you on the phone with to figure out, okay, what do we do? How do we get started? How can we help? What are your thoughts on firewalls for the home? I work primarily from home. That's a great question. I don't think there's a lot of value to try and put a firewall appliance like on the end of your cable or fiber DSL connection, whatever it is. I think the router that you have does that well enough. The better place to put those controls is locking down that workstation that's on that network, because you need to be safe not only from the internet, but also from all the other computers and devices on your network. You're not going to be able to secure your smart TV and your kids' gaming computer and things like that. Potentially, if you can have a different network segment for your laptop, but that's maybe a little bit more complex for most people. But definitely looking to make sure that your IT is locking down your laptop so that it's treating that network like a company network. So it's not exposing network shares from your laptop. Have your laptop running a software firewall, some of those next-gen antivirus or things like that. The energy should be securing your laptop, not securing that perimeter firewall at the home, at least to protect your company. Other than that, yeah, the cable routers, they only allow traffic in that's a response to traffic out. Your Linksys or whatever it is router is good enough for most people. Question, you're like a VPN. Yeah, that's one good way. A VPN can be configured a couple different ways. One of them is when you're connected to the VPN, only the traffic to the company goes to the VPN. That's called split tunneling. So traffic for the company goes over the VPN, traffic to the internet goes straight to the internet. The other model is once you're on the VPN, the only thing you can talk to is the VPN. So even your web traffic would go over the VPN back to your company through their firewall and filter out to the internet, which is a more secure approach, but it's also a bit more, it's going to slow things down if you're doing, if you're streaming radio from your PC while it's connected to the VPN, all that radio traffic is now going over the VPN circuit through your company out to the internet, slowing things down. So it's a trade-off, but that's one way to have your organization make sure your VPN does not use split tunneling. So when your computer's on the VPN, it can't talk to any other computers on the network or on the internet. It can only talk to stuff over the VPN. Thank you, everyone. If you have other questions, otherwise I think we'll end the call here. Thanks, everyone.